So you want a pet that's small, won't really outlive you, not really dangerous, no sharp teeth or claws, can't regulate its own body temperature, can't climb walls, isn't really an escape artist. Then you're looking for the leopard gecko, or a pet rock, I guess. Hello there and welcome back to the channel. My name is Adam and I'm the owner of Uncharted Wild and the 60 plus exotic species that live here. I have reptiles, bugs, arachnids, amphibians, basically everything except for a tiger. Today we are talking about what is hands down one of the best beginner pet reptiles out there. Anytime I'm doing an educational program and a parent comes up to me asking, hey, my kid is really into reptiles, they're 8, 10, 12 years old, what would be a good first reptile for them to kind of get at their age and take care of? I always make sure to name drop the leopard gecko because they are just super easy to take care of. They're very friendly. They don't get massive. It's not like going to a pet store and getting like a baby green iguana, which you should never do if you are brand new to reptiles. It's not a good idea. Few things before we get into the care itself. One, research. Make sure this is not your only research when you're getting a leopard gecko. I mean, I am flattered, but I don't know everything, and everyone kind of takes care of living things a little bit differently. Maybe my care video leaves out something someone else talks about. Maybe I explain something better than another care video you might have just watched. So make sure you try to learn as much as you can from a bunch of different sources about an animal before you bring it home. We're also not going to be talking about breeding. I do not breed any of my reptiles, so I will not be talking about that. There are other channels and care sheets out there that explain how to breed leopard geckos. I know they're a very popular entry point for breeding reptiles, but there are other ones out there that explain it much better than I ever could because I've never done it. Leopard geckos are easily one of the most popular pet reptiles on the planet, and for good reason. They don't get super big, usually not much longer than the length of your hand. They're super friendly. They don't really have any weapons like sharp teeth, sharp claws, a big tail to hit you with, like how you should hit the subscribe button. They're just a super friendly, all around little adorable lizard. Dustin here is my education leopard gecko. He's the only one I currently have, but unfortunately, I get quite a few of these in every year from people that just don't want him anymore. They're either surrendering them because their kids lost interest, they're tired of going to the pet store all the time to get crickets. So even this adorable little beginner-friendly pet lizard still gets rehomed fairly frequently, just like your giant 5+ feet angry iguanas and monitor lizards. So before you bring a leopard gecko home, just research, make 100% sure you are ready to take care of this for its entire 15+ year lifespan. When they're young, they're basically impossible to sex outwardly, but as they get older, the males will develop these big hemipenal bulges right at the cloaca at the base of the tail, so you can tell that way. Finding a captive bred one is very easy. That's basically all there is for sale. If you go to just about any reptile expo, I guarantee at least a third of the tables, if not more, will have leopard geckos on it. They are very, very easy to breed. You go to just about any pet store, you'll find leopard geckos. You can also find a bunch on Craigslist, people trying to rehome them. Now, if this is your first ever leopard gecko, I would personally recommend you get one from a reptile expo, from an actual reputable breeder, not from a pet store, because usually the pet stores will house them together, and sometimes on calci sand, which we'll go over in a bit, so they might come sick or not in good shape, and then obviously Craigslist has its own hazards. So if this is your first ever pet lizard, I would go with a reptile expo gecko. You can get a plain old leopard gecko like Dustin here for $20, $30, maybe $40. So they're really not an expensive lizard. Now, if you want one that's a little bit cooler looking, for even under $100, you still have a whole bunch of different colors and morphs available because so many people are breeding them, and now the prices have kind of come down on so many kind of more common morphs. You can get a bunch of different crazy colored leopard geckos for $50 to $100, which might sound like a lot to some people, but if you look at some of the expensive reptiles we've talked about in the past, those guys are really crazy priced. Perhaps the easiest lizard to home in your house is the leopard gecko. They really don't require a whole lot of space, and you have a whole bunch of different options when it comes to what you want to keep your gecko in. They're a terrestrial gecko. They don't have the special toes to stick to walls like crested geckos, leopard geckos, lychee geckos, a lot of your tropical arboreal species. These guys' floor space is most important, and it means they're not as big of an escape artist as a lot of those geckos too. As far as cohabiting your leopard geckos go, I know there are people out there that do it, and I know there are people out there that vehemently argue against it. Now, I don't really have the experience to advise you one way or the other. I've never cohabbed any of my leopard geckos before. Granted, all the leopard geckos I've gotten in have all been males. So if you are going to try cohabbing, one, look at other websites and care videos and things. There are dedicated videos just about cohabbing, so you want to check those before you try it. Also, if you are going to cohab, make sure that you do not put a male and a male together because they will fight. Do not put a male and a female together because if this is your first kind of foray into reptile keeping, you don't want to end up with babies, which is most likely what will happen. And also, if you decide later down the line, okay, I've got this gecko down, I know what I'm doing, I want to try cohabbing, don't buy a new one and put it in. Don't put an adult and a juvenile together because that's a huge size difference and it will not end well for the smaller ones. I have heard of people keeping a couple of females together, but again, I don't have the experience here, so honestly, I would advise if you are dead set on trying to cohab a couple female leopard geckos, look it up. There are whole videos just dedicated to cohabbing leopard geckos, so make sure you do your research if that's something you want to try. Your first option is just a glass tank, a glass aquarium like you find at a pet store. They're very easy to find, and normally pet stores have like $1 per gallon sales a few times a year. Now, there will be some people out there that say you can keep a leopard gecko in a 10-gallon tank its whole life, but if you put an adult leopard gecko in a 10-gallon, you will see just kind of how small that is. A juvenile in there is fine, but for an adult leopard gecko, I usually recommend something bigger. 15-gallon, even 20-gallon long. That's actually what I keep Dustin here in. Tanks are really easy to sterilize and also move because they're not at this size. They're not going to be very heavy, and they are easy to secure. They don't need anything heavy duty on top. Just get a regular mesh lid for the size of that tank and put it on. You don't need clamps or weights or anything like that. This is not a snake. He's not going to be able to get up to that lid. Next up is PVC. These cages look really sleek. They are very, very easy to move because they're very lightweight. They're also really easy to sanitize, but for the most part, they are very expensive. The smallest I could find that like Animal Plastics or someone makes is a 2 foot by 2 foot by 1 foot, which would be a very big space for a single leopard gecko. This is usually what I keep in some of my colubrid snakes in, and it costs almost $200 without shipping. So if you want to spend the money or try to build one yourself, if you have the know-how, go for it. But I mean, a glass tank honestly would just be easier. There's also wood enclosures. Now, I don't usually recommend them for leopard geckos because leopard geckos don't need a whole lot of space, and wooden enclosures, even the smaller ones, can be pretty heavy, and you have to worry about sealing the wood, sealing the inside seams and all that. And if you don't have the know-how to build one yourself, you're going to have to pay someone to build it for you and most likely ship it to you. And if you're going to spend all that money, you might as well just go with a PVC enclosure, which is lighter weight and easier to sanitize, and you don't have to worry about sealing it. Last up are plastic enclosures, either standalone plastic bins or the shelves that you put in a rack system. And this is what I recommend most after glass tanks. Now, they're very easy to clean and sterilize, and you can find them very easily. You can get packs of them on Amazon. You can go to just about any Walmart or Target and they will have plastic bins. For a smaller gecko, you're going to need something like a 6 to 12 quart tub, and as they get bigger, an adult gecko, you're going to need a 28 quart minimum. And if you're going to try and cohab multiple females together, you're going to need even bigger than that. Now, because these aren't an arboreal gecko, you don't need to worry about the height of it a whole lot. You don't need to get one of those giant heavy-duty storage tubs. If you just get one of those regular kind of flat ones, like I'm going to be showing you a video of right now, that'll work perfectly. Many breeders keep leopard geckos in rack systems with great success, making babies and happy geckos all around. And if you're going to try and do this, I've never had a rack system, so I can't coach you on it, but if you're going to do this, just make sure you do your research into how to heat a rack system and just make sure you get the right sized plastic tubs. Bedding is probably the most controversial and debated part of leopard gecko care, and it's really weird to say that any part of animal care is controversial, but depending on what Facebook pages or websites you frequent and post in, you're either going to be yelled at for keeping your leopard gecko on loose substrate or yelled at for keeping them on a flat, sterile bottom. So really, no matter where you are, you're probably going to lose. Ultimately, I'm not going to tell you straight what to do. I'm going to advise you and give you options that have worked great for me because I've used both loose substrate and sterile bottoms very, very well. They both have worked to great success for me because, like I said, I get a lot of leopard geckos in since I've started taking in surrendered reptiles a couple years ago. So I have kind of run the gamut on all these. So I'm going to tell you what's worked for me, and I'm also going to tell you what not to do. Never, ever use calcium sand for your leopard gecko or really any reptile. Calcium sand is an absolute trash substrate. It is terrible. It should not be sold at expos, online, or at pet stores. It kills way more reptiles than it's ever helped. Calcium sand is the worst substrate option for your leopard gecko. When a leopard gecko eats, they kind of just dive head first. So if you're feeding them on loose substrate, this is kind of where the anti-loose substrate crowd gets a lot of their argument. They're worried about impaction because the leopard gecko just swallows whatever it's substrates in its mouth. But if you have a healthy adult lizard, they can pass some substrate no problem. This calcium sand garbage, on the other hand, this stuff clumps inside the leopard gecko. It'll block up intestines and they will get impacted from this. It kills so many leopard geckos. And also, never use aquarium sand. I never thought I was gonna have to tell someone this, but a few years ago I got a surrendered leopard gecko that was kept on the multicolored fish sand from aquariums, and it was so impacted with the stuff. I could actually see some of the rainbow through its belly. It was bone skinny. It was coming out both ends. It was throwing up the sand. It would not eat, and unfortunately I just brought it right to the vet to be euthanized because there was nothing that could be done. So do not keep them on any type of straight pet store sand. It's terrible. And on a less extreme note, I'd also advise staying away from those like wood shaving substrate like aspen bedding. Works great for snakes, but not so much for geckos. Now I'll break the workable options down into sterile and loose substrate. First up is the easiest we're going to talk about today to clean, which is just plain old newspaper and paper towel. Super easy to just bundle up, throw it out, and put new one down. And at least in my experience, leopard geckos almost always pick one corner of the enclosure to go to the bathroom in. So if your leopard gecko does do this, it's very easy to just put extra pieces down in that corner. Anytime you bring home a new leopard gecko, or really any reptile, snake, lizard, whatever, but I would advise keeping them on paper towel or newspaper for the first month or so. And this is part of the quarantine process, and you want to do this for a few reasons. One, if your animal, you get it from an expo and you bring it home, mites on leopard geckos aren't super common, but I guess it could happen. But you want to do this so you can observe mites, and if they are there, so that way it doesn't spread to the rest of your animals. You also want to be able to observe if it's eating, if it's pooping, if its poops look healthy, and this will be really easy to do on newspaper and harder to find on loose substrate. It might get kind of covered up with dirt or something like that. So if it has internal parasites or anything that's present in the poop, you'll be able to see that. Newspaper isn't really that nice to look at, so if you want to keep your leopard geckos on something that looks a little bit nicer, there's reptile carpet, that green kind of rug that you can put down. Now, this is also fairly easy to clean. You just take it out and hose it off, and sometimes you can throw it in the wash, but over time, eventually this stuff I found will continue to have a smell even after washing it, so you will need to swap it out every once in a while. And some people also say that it'll fray, and the leopard gecko will either get its toes caught in these loose strands or might even try to eat them. Any of the times I've had leopard geckos on this, I haven't run into that, so I can't 100% say it doesn't happen. It just hasn't happened to me. So if you do see your kind of reptile carpet fraying a whole lot, maybe just swap it out for a newer one. I mean, a leopard gecko is not going to be super rough on it anyway, so it shouldn't happen fairly quickly. And then my personal favorite for like a solid bottom is you go to a hardware store and you go to the flooring aisle like at Home Depot or Lowe's, and you just get plain unfinished slate flooring tile, and you can kind of break it and score it to the size you need. And this stuff is really, really nice. It's easy to clean. Just pop it out, hose it down, scrub it down, and then you don't have to worry about it degrading over time like the reptile carpet might. And it also will hold heat. When we talk about heating, this will be really important. It'll hold heat for your leopard gecko. And on top of that, this is a natural surface. It's a rock surface. So they will be kind of slowly filing their nails down as they walk along this. So in my opinion, this is my favorite and kind of the most bang for your buck if you're going to be doing this. As for loose substrate, you got a few options as well. The most popular is probably just plain old dry eco earth. It's very kind of fluffy, dry stuff, and it holds humidity really, really well, which will help for a certain part of your leopard gecko enclosure, which we're going to talk about in a bit. But for the majority of it, you're going to need it fairly dry, and that means dry eco earth can get sometimes really dusty, so I don't use this fully. What I do is I actually mix this eco earth in with some other things to make my substrate mix. I use some eco earth, I use some plain old topsoil, and then I also use wash play sand. You want to use wash play sand and not like construction sand. And what I do is I mix this all together. I use a ratio, I think, of like maybe 50% sand, 40% topsoil, and then 10% eco-earth, and you can kind of play around with it. And this is actually a really good base for a bioactive substrate if you're going to try that. And this is honestly what I use for just about all of my lizards, whether it's my smaller lizards like this guy, or my blue-tongued skink, or even if it's my big lizards like my iguanas, or my tegus, or my monitor lizards. I just kind of mix the ratio of sand and soil and other things to kind of suit that animal's needs. Now, my leopard gecko enclosure is not bioactive, but a lot of leopard gecko enclosures are bioactive. There's a whole bunch of keepers that have them on semi-aridish kind of bioactive setups. I never really had much luck with mine, and anytime I tried to put plants in there, they would just dig them up. So I haven't gotten mine to work. As we talked about in my leopard gecko spotlight, where we talked about these guys in the wild, these guys are not found just on desert. They're not just found on straight sand. They're found in these kind of grassland, arid to semi-arid, rocky outcropping like ranges. And where they're from, they don't just live on 100% sand. So if you're keeping your gecko on any type of sand, just 100%, that is wrong. But if you take some sand and mix it in with some other things, that can work just fine. There is dry, sandy soil where these guys live. Not 100%, mind you, but if you think a leopard gecko in the wild never encounters any type of dry, sandy substrate, then you're just wrong. As I said, many leopard gecko keepers are going to call you a terrible owner if they see that you're keeping your gecko on loose substrate because they think it's a terrible option. And on the different side of the same coin, if you go into bioactive groups and you're keeping yours on newspaper, you're going to get called, oh, that's not natural, that's not good keeping. So you really kind of lose no matter what group you go into. There are advantages and disadvantages to both sides. There are good things and bad things both about loose substrate and sterile setups. So you just got to do your research, make sure you can kind of find what works best for you, what do you think is going to be easiest for you to do, what's going to keep your gecko happiest and healthiest. So just, again, do as much research as you can because, like I said, bedding is a very kind of hot topic as far as leopard geckos go. One thing I will mention about loose substrate is, like I said, if the leopard gecko eats some substrate, you have a healthy adult leopard gecko, you're fine. But if you're just throwing crickets in the enclosure, just make sure your leopard gecko is really, really well hydrated so they can keep passing any substrate they do happen to eat. Some people just mitigate these potential risks by either feeding their mealworms in a bowl, or what I do is I actually tong feed Dustin here, and he just eats them right off the tongs, no problem for me. So if you are worried about that, there's a few ways to kind of get around it. For temperature, you want a temperature gradient, which is why I usually recommend longer enclosures like the 28-quart tub or a 20-gallon long tank, because this allows you to kind of more effectively nail an actual temperature gradient where you have a warm side and a cool side. For the warm side of your enclosure, you want it somewhere right around 90 degrees. So you want it in like the 86 to 91 degree ballpark. And for the spot either right below or right above your main heat source, whether you're using an under tank heater or a heat lamp, we'll talk about that next. But you want it probably right in like the 93, 94, maybe 95 degree range. You don't want it super hot. You don't ever want to get it like close to 100 or over 100 like a bearded dragon needs. And for the cool side of your enclosure, you want it somewhere in like the 77 to 83 degree range, something right around 80. And these are just ranges. It's not like if your hot side is 87 or your cool side is 76, your gecko is going to immediately keel over and die. These are just ranges. If you're off by a few degrees, it's not going to have a huge impact. But if your hot side goes up to over 100, yes, that is most likely not going to make for a happy gecko. At night, I would say it's fine if the enclosure kind of cools off, but you want to keep it at minimum 70, 71 degrees. You don't want it getting into the 60s. They do need it some kind of warm. And depending on where you live, if it stays warm year round, you might be able to get away with never needing a nighttime heat source. The ambient heat in the room might always stay high enough. For humidity, this is not a tropical gecko. They do not need a high humidity like your chameleons, your iguanas, your crested geckos even. These guys are fine, most likely fine with just the ambient humidity of your home, because most of the time your humidity in your house is somewhere in the 30 to 50% range, which is basically kind of what they need. You won't need to mist the whole enclosure down like you would with those lizards, but you will need something called a humid hide. Now we're going to talk about this more in the actual decor section, but with this humid hide, it's basically kind of more of a closed off hide box, and you're going to put something in there to kind of help hold humidity, whether it's paper towel or moss or something like that. And you will need to mist that probably every 2 to 3 days or so during kind of just the normal year. And then if they're shedding, which leopard geckos tend to do fairly often, you're going to want to probably mist it every day during this process. There are two main ways to heat your enclosure, either some type of bulb with a lamp fixture or an under tank heater or like heat tape for a rack system. For both of them, regardless if it's above or below, you're going to want it kind of to one side of the enclosure to keep that temperature gradient, and this will kind of help reinforce the temps of your warm side. For bulbs, you won't need anything really special. It's just a normal incandescent bulb. You can get one from a pet store if you want, but I just get them in boxes of like 20 or something off Amazon or from Home Depot, so you can just use those. And you won't need anything super high wattage either. You won't need like a 100-watt bulb. Probably something like 60 to 75 watt will be fine, and you can kind of control this depending on how far away your bulb is from your gecko, depending on how tall your setup is. These are not a basking lizard like a beardy or an iguana. They are not diurnal. They are not going to come out to sit under that light, so you do want to kind of scooch it a little bit closer to your warm side hide so that he does get a little bit elevated of a temperature. And this is why you're going to give him multiple hides, which we'll talk about in the decor section, but this way he can kind of stay hidden and either stay hidden and warm or go to the cool side and cool off, but while also feeling secure. You can also use an under tank heater, which is basically a panel that adheres to the bottom of your tank. And with this, there usually comes these 4 little nodes that you need to put at each corner of the tank, and this will raise it up just enough to let some airflow under there. When you're using an under tank heater, you need some type of airflow. So either use the nodes or put it on like a metal shelf that has like a graded shelving so that some type of airflow goes, because if this heat builds up, that does not end well. So you want to make sure you have some type of airflow. And you also want to make sure you're using a thermostat with this. And the thermostat works, you plug the under tank heater into the thermostat. The thermostat has a probe on it that you're going to put dead center of the heat mat inside the enclosure, because you want the heat mat to take up like 1/3 to half the size of the warm side of the tank. But this is going to let you control, you set the temperature, and that way if it gets too hot, it'll kick off. If it gets too cold, it'll kick back on, and then you plug this into the wall. And you need this because some of these under tank heaters burn way too hot, so you need to make sure you're using this so that your gecko doesn't potentially get any kind of burns if the under tank heater gets too hot. And this works great for your solid sterile bottoms like the slate or the reptile carpet, but if you have a few inches of dirt like I do and bioactive substrates do, this really won't be that effective because the under tank heater really only heats the few inches right above it. So in this instance, you will most likely need to use a heat lamp. And then another thing about the under tank heater, it can also be kind of a fire hazard if you're using like a plastic container for your enclosure, so just be careful with that. Like I said in the temperature section, you need to keep this enclosure above 70 to 72 at night. Now if you're using the under tank heater, you can just leave that on 24/7, problem solved. But if you're using a heat bulb, you need to come up with something to do at night, and I would strongly recommend against using those red nighttime bulbs, because it's a myth that they can't see them. Sure, they might not be able to see the red light, but they still see the light, so you do not want to use those because it disrupts their night cycle. Your best bet for a nighttime heat source from above is a low wattage ceramic heat emitter, and I'll have links for everything I'm talking about in this video in the description below. But you want to use something low wattage. Ceramic heat emitter is basically just a bulb that only emits heat, not light, and some of these suckers can burn really hot, so you don't need anything super high wattage, nothing like 120 watt one. You just want to get something maybe like 40 to 60 watt. As we know from the previously mentioned animal spotlight video on leopard geckos are crepuscular. They are not nocturnal. They are most active at dawn and dusk as it's getting dark out and as it's getting light out. And because of this, they are not a diurnal basking lizard like a beardy or an iguana, so they do not necessarily need a UV light. Now some keepers still keep their geckos with a UV light, which is fine. I mean, as long as you're using the right kind, it's not going to be harmful. And if you have a bioactive substrate with live plants, they'll actually benefit a lot from this, but it is not absolutely essential to their continued existence like it is with beardies, uromastyx, etc. And they do need a day-night cycle. They do need a period of dark and a period of light. Now, if you're using a lightless under tank heater, you will need to use something like just a basic LED bulb will be fine. But if you have them in a pretty bright room with window light, that'll be fine. Now, you don't want to put them directly in front of the window, because the sun coming in through the glass of the window and then into their enclosure, that'll turn their enclosure into like an oven, which is obviously not going to end well for the gecko. So you want to put it kind of off to the side where the light illuminates the room, illuminates the enclosure, but is not cooking your gecko and directly hitting your tank. And as I just mentioned in the heating section, don't use one of those red light nighttime bulbs because they can still see the light, so that will disrupt their night cycle, so don't use it. First thing you need for decorating your enclosure are 2 hides minimum, one on each side of the enclosure, so they can still feel secure while regulating their body temperature and either cool off or warm up. And obviously some hides in the middle aren't going to hurt. Now on the warm side, you can either have a regular hide and a humid hide, or you can make your warm hide your dedicated humid hide. And what a humid hide is it's a more sealed off hide box that you'll mist every other day or daily when they're in shed. And this helps the skin loosen up so that they can get it all off. Otherwise, your gecko's toe sheds and other things might actually remain and constrict their blood flow, causing them to drop their toes off. Like Diego, my leopard gecko, who unfortunately passed away earlier this year, but he had no toes left. He just had little nubs because his previous owner just kept him on a straight arid setup with no humidity whatsoever, no humid hide box or anything. So he never got to get that help to loosen up the toe shed, so they just stuck onto them, and like I said, doesn't end well. For your humid hide, you can just use a plastic like cave that you can find online or at a pet store, or you could just make one yourself. Get a small plastic container, cut a hole in it, either tape or kind of like melt the rim of the hole so it's not super sharp, and that'll work just fine. And in this humid hide, you want to put something that retains water, whether it's paper towel, moss, which is what I use. You could also just use a more water absorbing substrate like Eco Earth. Any of these will work. You just need to make sure that it kind of holds water more than the rest of the enclosure. You don't need to get like fancy, expensive reptile branded hides or plants or anything. I mean, with a lot of my animals, I just use plastic containers or cardboard boxes because it gets the job done. You don't need to buy these $40 fake caves and things like that. You can do it aesthetically if you want, but I mean, if you want to save some money, the gecko doesn't care. And your hides don't have to be straight hide caves or boxes. They can be like pieces of cork bark, or even just take fake plants or vines and just kind of put them down on their side or just lay them in the enclosure. The gecko will hide under them. Those work just as well. One thing I think more leopard gecko owners should do is put rocks in the enclosure for their leopard gecko to climb on and kind of wear their nails down a little bit and give them some workout and exercise, because that's where they're from in the wild. In the wild, they live on these big rocky embankments, hiding in these little rocky outcroppings and crevices for hidey holes and things like that. So that'll help mimic their natural kind of landscape. And you can just go to a pet store online and buy like kind of sterile reptile rocks, but what I do is I just go outside and grab some rocks. Now, some people will yell at you for just grabbing things from outside and putting it in the enclosure, but rocks I think are fine. You can kind of freeze them or put them in boiling water for X amount of hours or whatever they say online to sterilize them if you want, but I usually just take the rock inside, hose it off, and then just put it right in with the leopard gecko. And I've been doing that for 8+ years with no problems whatsoever. So again, if you are worried about it, you can just buy the sterile rocks offline, or you can use one of the different sterilization methods. But I mean, a lot of bioactive people, they're just taking stuff from outside, putting it in the enclosure because they want whatever beneficial bacteria or isopods or whatever kind of clinging to the wood. If you just put it in your enclosure, you should be fine, as long as you know you're grabbing it from an area that doesn't have pesticides or anything like that. Water is really easy. Just give them a water bowl. Despite being a semi-arid animal, they still will drink water if you provide it for them. They will climb in the water bowl. So just give them a kind of lower water bowl. You don't need something super tall, and just make sure it's big enough for them to kind of submerge in and crawl into if they want to. As for your water source, I have well water, so I know my water is good from the tap, but if you have like city water or you don't know quite what's in your well water, you can use stuff like Repti-Safe and other chemicals that kind of help neutralize chlorine and whatever else might be in the water. And you can also just, I mean, just buy like bottled water and use that if you want to, but that's going to be pretty expensive. So you can get filtered water. I mean, you have quite a few options, but if you're really worried about it, use Repti-Safe or something like that. Leopard geckos need bugs, some type of insect protein. That's all you're going to be feeding them. They need mealworms. You can do superworms, dubia roaches, crickets, waxworms, a bunch of different options. Some should be more as treats, and some should be staple diets. The ones I would say are more of a staple diet are going to be your dubia roaches, mealworms, and your crickets. You want to avoid the waxworms and all the other ones that are maybe a little bit too fatty or something like that. I would say those three would be a good staple. Dubias are the healthiest and definitely easier to keep alive than crickets, but if you only have one gecko, you probably don't need to start a whole dubia roach breeding colony. So a couple trips to the pet store every week to pick up some mealworms and crickets will probably be your best bet. Also, mealworms can't chew through reptile stomachs. A lot of people propagate this myth. It is not true. They can't do it. You don't need to cut the mealworms' heads off before you feed it to the leopard gecko. Just feed the lizard the mealworms, you're okay. Young leopard geckos, you want to feed daily, and the adults every other day. As much as they'll eat in like 5 or so minutes, they'll let you know when they're full. Dustin here usually eats about 5 to 6 roaches, and then he kind of slows down and stops. And just make sure that the food isn't too big. You want to make sure that the roaches or crickets are no wider than the space between their eyes. If you're worried about the weight, just check the tail. The tail is their fat storage. So if the tail is too big and bulbousy, cut back on the feedings. If the tail is way too skinny, then you need to kind of start upping the feedings more and get them to eat more. You'll need to dust your bugs a few times a week with a calcium powder and a multivitamin powder. Now, there are 2 different types of calcium powder out there for sale. There's calcium with D3 and without D3. What I do with my non-UV light needing lizards, like my leopard and crested geckos, is I use the calcium with D3. With UV lights, you want to use the one without D3. You want to dust the bugs twice a week with this calcium powder and once a week with the multivitamin vitamin powder. And you also have to make sure you're not over supplementing your gecko. And what I mean by that is leopard geckos get these kind of weird bulbousy sacs right behind their armpit. If they have too much calcium, that's their calcium storage. So if you start seeing those develop, just kind of back off on the calcium, maybe only do it once a week or not at all until you see them going down. It's not a life-threatening thing, it's just something you want to keep an eye out for. Many people will also say you can give your gecko a little bowl or cup of calcium just for them to kind of come and lick up whenever they want. Now, I've never done this with any of my geckos. Dustin here actually seems pretty sensitive to the calcium because I give him the same amount of calcium I've given any of my leopard geckos that have come through, but he seems to get those little sac things kind of frequently, so I kind of cut back on my calcium level with him. But if you are going to do this, I would recommend using the calcium without D3, because with the calcium with D3, too much calcium is actually a bad thing for reptiles, and since you're already giving them the needed amount with your twice a week dustings, you just don't want to do too much D3. This is a very easy to handle little gecko for the most part. Now, if you are bringing a brand new leopard gecko home, I would recommend just like putting it on newspaper to kind of observe it. Also, don't handle it right away. Kind of let it get settled in, let it get used to you, let it kind of get used to its surroundings, get used to a feeding schedule, kind of learn you through the feedings. The first few times you handle your leopard gecko, I would just do it in the enclosure. Just keep your hands in the tub or the tank and just kind of let it walk between your hands. Like you can see with Dustin here. And with these guys, when you bring home a brand new leopard gecko, one that's never really been handled, they're gonna, for the most part, usually be really squiggly and jumpy. They will run right out of your hands. And this way, if you're doing it in the setup that they know, they're gonna recognize kind of the decor and everything because you're not going far. They're not going to a new environment. They might be calmer. And if he does fall out of your hands, it won't go far and it's not gonna hurt itself. Now, when I first brought Dustin home, Dustin had almost never been handled. So Dustin was super jumpy and squiggly, and he has gotten so much better in the time I've had him. A few ways to kind of get around it. Woo. Then the next few times that you go to handle them, I would take them out and sit on the couch or a chair or something like that. So just kind of hold them in your lap like I'm doing with Dustin now. Let them get used to being on your hands. They're in a newer environment, but that way if they fall, they're not going to fall very far. They fall on your lap or onto the couch or the chair. Even let them kind of explore the chair or couch. Maybe just don't let them like get in the cushions, but let them kind of get used to environments, get confident in environments, things like that. Get confident with you handling it, and you'll get more confident holding a kind of little fragile lizard in your hands. And as you're handling them, if they just continue to be really, really squiggly, or if they pee on you or anything like that, don't put them back right away. Don't put them back, because that'll kind of teach them, okay, if I pee on the person or if I just keep trying to jump out of their hands, they'll put me down. So you don't want to kind of, I guess, quote unquote, reward that behavior. So just kind of keep handling them, let them calm down on their own, let them get used to kind of just being in people's hands and things like that. Just keep your hands nice and flat and still and nice and calm. Just about every leopard gecko I've ever had, even some of my kind of worst rescues, they've all been fairly handleable as soon as you start kind of working with them some. They seem to kind of socialize and tame up pretty quickly because they're a small lizard. They're just scared. They're not like an iguana where they can do damage to you or anything like that. They do have pokey little nails sometimes, but it's not anything super bad. And also, a few warnings, they don't have those sticky toes like a crested gecko does, so they're not going to be able to really grip you back like an arboreal gecko can. So you do have to kind of make sure that they are flat and secure, because if your arm starts slipping or they start slipping off, they're not going to be able to grab themselves like a crested gecko can. So you need to look out for that. And also, they can drop their tail. Like just about any gecko species, they can drop their tail. Now, they do grow it back. So if they do drop their tail, it's not the end of the world. Again, not like a crested gecko. Cresteds don't grow their tail back, but it's not the end of the world. They will grow it back, but it doesn't look normal. It doesn't look the same. It doesn't grow back with the same colors or shape or anything like that. And you just want to make sure that when you pick up a gecko, you want to kind of scoop under it. You want to kind of scoop under the gecko, just like that. You don't want to pick it up by the head. You don't want to pick it up by the tail, because it will pop the tail right off. And he's just going to climb me now. So very easy to hold. And once they get confident, they get pretty confident. And the tail's not super sensitive. It's not like if you brush against the tail or if your finger touches it the wrong way, he's going to drop it. That's all part of getting the gecko used to you. So that way when the gecko is out, and that's why I can let Dustin be held by kids. That's why if the gecko is out and confident, it's going to be much less likely to drop that tail, because it'll just be like, oh, it's just being in people's hands. I'm used to this. It's not, oh my God, what's going on, Pop? So that was our care video for the leopard gecko, what is easily one of the easiest reptiles on the planet to take care of, and definitely one of the most adorable. If you liked the video, make sure you leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our future videos, like more care videos and things. The link for our Patreon will be down in the description. If you want to do it for as low as $5 a month while supporting us, you can get some cool perks like sneak peeks of new animals we're getting before anyone else, early access to our YouTube videos, things like that. Make sure you comment down below if you have a leopard gecko or you found this video useful, or if you have any questions. Hopefully you found it useful. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you later.